Welcome to Biblios, the place where we think about biblical thinking. Today we have with us again Dr. Paulien. Dr. Paulien, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start by reading a passage from Psalm 88, verses 15 to the end. From my youth I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. With the Bible being a book that presumably is there to promote the God of the Bible, every so often you come across passages such as Psalm 88, and you can't help but feel that perhaps it's not doing so good a job. Why are passages like Psalm 88 found in a book such as the Bible?
Well, I think often we come to the Bible with expectations of what God is like, what He's willing to tolerate, and a whole lot of other things. And then you run into stuff like this. I mean, I think we would say this guy's clinically depressed. You know, when people are depressed, the world becomes far darker than it actually is. And they imagine futures that are absolutely horrific and so on. So you have here a great example of depression. Interesting thing, if you come to the Bible in the expectation that it is a book about God, as it claims to be, the question is, what does it tell us about God? That this is in the Bible. And I think one thing that everybody can see in this text is that the Bible, God does not shy away from authentic expressions. Many people accuse people of religion as sort of, I think it was Karl Marx that said, just a opiate of the people. You're just hiding from reality, living in a fantasy world. This is not a fantasy world. This is a world, I think, that just about every reader can recognize. Every one of us has dark moments. In some cases, it's 4 a.m, when you have trouble sleeping. In other cases, it's all day long. People can relate to the idea of spiritual, emotional, mental darkness. God evidently is not offended when people tell it like it is. And even when they blame Him. In the Psalm, he's blaming God. You brought this on me. And certainly when people are depressed and when they're feeling that way, it often seems like God must have brought this upon me. See? So I think, if you don't start with the assumption that this is a fantasy book or something, if you say, well, if this is expressing God, what's it saying? It's saying God appreciates authenticity. And the second thing it says, I think, is that God gives us the freedom to say how we really feel. He appreciates it. He doesn't mind it. He's willing to be challenged. He's willing to be questioned. And that's maybe a different picture of God than a lot of people have had.
I think, maybe on a sort of personal one-to-one level, perhaps we could maybe see a conversation like this taking place between somebody and God. But I think one of the interesting things with this passage is, it's one of the Psalms. And the Psalms are seen by a number in the scholarly community as being perhaps the songbook of Israel. And so potentially we have a passage such as this, which could have been performed publicly or even as a community. What does that sort of suggest about maybe, in your words, authentic expression sort of within a community setting and also to God?
Well, from a believer's perspective, it also tells me that God is the one who created emotion. And God does not want us to stifle our emotions. I think one of the strongest marks of psychological dysfunction is when people stifle their emotions. They act as if certain bad things never happened to them. They just shut down and don't feel anymore. And I've counseled a number of people who just had no feelings. Just when they go through life and they feel nothing, and that's one way of not connecting with something abusive that happened in the past. God created us with feelings, and feeling the feelings is okay. God wants us to be authentically ourselves. And so if the Bible didn't have passages like this, we might wonder whether God approved But there's enough stuff in the Psalms on the dark side that you realize God wants us to be real. And if a person's part of a church or a religious community, a community that's hiding from reality is not what God approves. God wants communities to be open, to be welcoming of people who suffer. If God welcomes a person like this, then He would want the church to do the same, don't you think?
So then, are you saying that God is as happy with what's expressed in Psalms 88 as He is with like Psalm 23 as well? Are those almost equal before God in positions of relation to Him?
Well, that's a tough one. You're asking a difficult one, because obviously any parent would be happier if a child comes up and puts their arms up, throws their arms around their neck and says, "I love you, Daddy." I mean, any parent would probably be happier with that than a child who says, "You did this to me," you know. But at the same time, a child who can freely express how they feel is really complimenting the parent. They feel safe to tell the truth about themselves. They feel safe to tell how they feel. And I've seen abused children, and when they come up to the parent, they're just cowering and they're not willing to say anything because they fear if they say something, they'll get hit again. So when a child challenges, there's a sense of safety in doing that. And the classic example is in the book of Job, within the Bible. In the book of Job, Job challenges God. He even rails at him at times. And his friends are kind of like, "Oh no, God's going to strike you down. Oh no, what do you think you're doing? This is terrible, don't you dare look at God because, He'll kill you." And Job says, "Well, if He kills me, so be it. I want to tell Him how I really feel." And when the end of the story comes, God says, "Job, you spoke right, and your friends were wrong." The friends were giving all the usual stuff that Christians say about suffering. "Oh, maybe if you're suffering, it's not God's fault, it's because you did something wrong." Or maybe if you're suffering, God is trying to teach you a lesson and so on. God says none of that stuff. Job told the truth when he said he had, that it was pointless, his suffering, that he had no reason to be hurting like this. God appreciated his honest and open appraisal. And one more thing, you go to the cross of Jesus Christ. And what does Jesus say just before He dies?
My God, why have you forsaken me?"
Why have you forsaken me? If Jesus could express how He felt before God, it must be okay for us. And that tells me, the temptation I have when I pray, and I expect a lot of viewers have the same temptation. Maybe you guys can relate to this. But I suspect that, so when I pray, the toughest thing is I sort of go into default mode, bless the missionaries and the colporteurs and thank you for this and so on. And yet it isn't coming from the depths of my soul. And what God appreciates is not empty prayers, not vain repetitions. God appreciates when we tell how we really feel. That's what friends do. If a friend feels forsaken by another friend, they say, "Man, why'd you leave me like this? Why'd you leave me in the lurch?" And a true friend will listen to that pain and heal the situation. And that's what God does.
So do you see Psalm 88 as being sort of a normal part of one's faith journey if someone's a spiritual person? Is it just something that happens to us when we go through an extreme set of circumstances? Where do you see this sort of experience featuring within?
Excellent question. And the reality is absolutely. I think when many people of God suffer, they feel like they're the only ones. They feel like somehow, they've been left out. And they look in the church and see everybody with their smiling faces, and don't realize that a quarter of them or more may be going through what I call a dark night of the soul. And I think that scholars who have studied this psychologically and in terms of faith development, have discovered that nearly every person of faith at some point in their life will go through a dark night of the soul. That'll be a time when everything seems to go wrong, when everything they believed doesn't make sense anymore, when they pray and it doesn't go further than the ceiling. Probably everyone 50 years or older, just about everybody who's walked with God, can talk about such a time, a dark night of the soul. And I remember once talking to a group of pastors. There were several hundred, and in that group there were 10 youth pastors. So these were guys like in their 30s, maybe 40. And when I shared the concept of the dark night of the soul and how a person can go through a stage where they can't reach God and they just, everything seems to be falling apart. When I shared all of that, they went to lunch together and they started sharing on that. And every one of those 10 said, when he talked about that, I thought he was talking about me. And they realized that all 10 of them were going through the same experience at the same time, but they've never told each other. They'd never opened up to each other. And that's why it's important, I think, in the Bible you have texts like this. It's important for people to realize even if you walk with God, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be hunky-dory all the time, that everything's going to be a rose garden. No, life is hard. Life in this world is still messed up. Even though you walk with God, there can be times that are difficult. And the message I would have to anybody watching is, if you're going through this experience right now and you feel like God has abandoned you, I just want you to know you're not alone. You're not the only person experiencing this. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about it with fellow members of the church. Because you'll find there's a lot of other people, when you open up, they'll open up too. You find out what they're going through as well, what the psalmist is going through. I'd say at any given time, maybe 20-25% of people will say, I'm going through that too.
I think something interesting you mentioned, though, when you were talking about it, is you mentioned it in terms of development. So going through something like that, can we see it as developing? Because I think normally when you're questioning and doubting everything, it would be a case that you're feeling you're regressing.
Great question. You know, I think a lot of times people of faith shy away from doubt. And there's a good reason for that, because doubt can often lead to more doubt. But there's also a doubt that leads to faith. When you doubt some of your secure self-assurance, that you're in the right path and you're in the right place, you're in the right church, you have the right ideas, you have the right everything. And people go through a phase like that where they kind of think they've solved all the problems of the world, and they're the only ones that don't realize that their words sound hollow to everybody else. But what a dark night of the soul can do for a person of faith is to begin wearing away some of the pride. You know, even people who've given their lives to God are often still proud and think they're better than others and so on. When you've gone through a dark night of the soul, you realize your weakness, your shallowness, you realize your ignorance. And after an experience like that, a person will tend to reach out to God with a renewed fervor, will have a deeper experience where they're more sympathetic to those who suffer, and where they begin to see other people through the eyes of God. And God sees the brokenness, God sees the pain. We often don't. We go to a church and everybody looks great, and there's so many suffering, you see. But when you understand that kind of suffering, then you begin to see it in others and your ministry becomes way more powerful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulien. You've been watching Biblios, where we've been thinking about biblical thinking. Please do join us again next time.